Some people may not be aware of Ambedkar's academic qualifications and his contributions to Sanskrit studies. As we discussed earlier, Ambedkar had a degree in Sanskrit from the University of Bombay and pursued further studies in the language at Columbia University and the University of Bonn. He also translated several Sanskrit texts into Marathi and English. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was proficient in Sanskrit and had a deep knowledge of Hindu scriptures. He learned Sanskrit at a young age and continued to study it throughout his life. He translated several Sanskrit texts into English and wrote extensively on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Indian history and culture. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar learned Sanskrit from a teacher named Pandit Shivram Apte, who was a respected scholar of Sanskrit and the principal of the Vasantrao Patil High School in Bombay. Ambedkar studied Sanskrit under Apte's guidance for several years in the early 1900s. Later, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar received a degree in Sanskrit grammar and literature called Shastri from the University of Bombay in 1918. There is evidence to support the claim that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar received a degree in Sanskrit called Shastri from the University of Bombay in 1918. Here are some references that provide evidence for this. In his book, Dr. Ambedkar and Democracy, the author Vasant Moon writes that Ambedkar completed his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1912, and then went on to study for a master's degree in economics. He also simultaneously studied Sanskrit and received the degree of Shastri from the University of Bombay in 1918. The University of Bombay, now known as the University of Mumbai, has a list of graduates on its website that includes B.R. Ambedkar, who received a degree in Sanskrit in 1918. The book, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Writings and Speeches, includes a letter from Ambedkar to his friend Vaman Mulhar Joshi, in which he writes, "I have passed my Shastri examination in Sanskrit. I hope I will not have to take up this subject again." In book, Dr. Ambedkar and Sanskrit, author Ramamurthy Naidu states that Ambedkar possessed a rare mastery over Sanskrit, which he acquired through years of diligent study and dedicated practice. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar translated several Sanskrit texts into English. One of his most famous translations is the ancient Hindu text, the Manusmriti, which he translated and published under the title, The Laws of Manu. This translation is highly regarded and has been widely cited in scholarly works on Hindu law and tradition. He also translated the Rigveda into English. Though this translation is not as well known, it is well documented that Ambedkar was a highly educated and accomplished scholar who had a deep interest in Sanskrit and Buddhist philosophy. He also made significant contributions to the study and translation of Sanskrit texts, particularly in relation to Buddhism. In his book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, which he wrote in both English and Sanskrit, Ambedkar demonstrated his deep understanding of the Sanskrit language and his ability to interpret complex philosophical concepts. Additionally, in his speeches and writings, he frequently referenced Sanskrit texts and used Sanskrit quotes to support his arguments. There are several books that discuss Ambedkar's command over Sanskrit. Some of them are Ambedkar and Buddhism by Sangharakshita. This book discusses Ambedkar's study of Sanskrit and his interpretation of Buddhist texts in the context of Indian social and political history. Dr. Ambedkar and Sanskrit by Srinivas Tilak. In his book, Dr. Ambedkar and Sanskrit, Srinivas Tilak argues that the criticisms of Ambedkar's command over Sanskrit are misguided and based on a misunderstanding of his views. Tilak presents several pieces of evidence to support his argument. Firstly, he points out that Ambedkar had a strong foundation in Sanskrit grammar and literature, having obtained a Shastri degree in Sanskrit from the University of Bombay in 1918. Secondly, Tilak cites several of Ambedkar's own writings and speeches, in which he demonstrates a deep understanding of Sanskrit and Hindu philosophy. For example, in his book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, Ambedkar extensively references Sanskrit texts such as the Vedas, Upanishads, and the Buddhist canon in order to make his arguments. Tilak also notes that Ambedkar's criticism of Hinduism was not based on a rejection of its Sanskrit-based tradition, but rather a rejection of the caste system and other social inequalities that were justified by certain interpretations of Hindu texts. Ambedkar and His Ideology by A. C. Sinha. This book explores the relationship between Ambedkar's social and political ideas and his study of Sanskrit, particularly his critique of the caste system and his advocacy for social and political equality.